Hi, this is Dacher Keltner, and I would like you to welcome you to Unbound, the Bay Area Book Festival's virtual conversation. Today we're going to be talking about something extremely timely, which is parenting during a time of crisis. I know a lot of you are thinking about that, and it is a privilege to have in conversation some of the best minds and advocates on this question. Sarah Ray is the author of A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety and has really thought hard about environmental issues during this time. Madeline Levine, PhD, has long been a leading voice in thinking about well-being and anxiety in youth today, and has a new book out, Ready or Not, preparing our kids for a really uncertain future. And then Christine Carter is also a leading voice in the science of happiness for children and its applications, has a wonderful new book out called The New Adolescence. Thank you all for joining me and joining this conversation.
Thank you.
This is such an extraordinary time, really transformative and transcendent. And everybody sees you in your living rooms, and I just want to take stock of wherever you guys are. How's it going right now for you guys during this COVID-19 pandemic? Madeline?
For me, it's not that different because I'm in my office 90% of the time. So, and I'm an introvert, so I don't mind being in my office. I think the thing I learned is I have a lot of stuff in my life that I don't need. And I thought I needed it, but I don't. So that'll be a change when this ends. But life, thank God, is good for me and my kids and my husband.
Yeah. Interesting how we start to look upon our life in a new way. Christine, how about you? How's it been?
Well, it's been humbling. My life has changed quite a lot. And things about it have been really wonderful. I have all four of my kids home, and 3 out of the 4 of them were away at school. So they're back, and that's wonderful. But, I've thought a lot about how we sort of cycle in and out of struggle with these things, and it has brought a lot of humility in my life. But I've learned that the Latin root of humility is humilitas, which means grounded, or from the earth. And so it's been kind of an interesting thing how this experience has been really grounding for me personally.
Yeah, it's funny to talk to people out in the world and, go on these social distancing hikes, and people are appreciating the grounding. They're looking at our materialistic life in a new light, feeling like time is slowing down. It's interesting. Mm-hmm. Sarah, how are you doing?
Well, I would say that it's very different. Unlike Madeline's comment, I have 2 kids and a working partner, and we both had to figure out how to juggle homeschooling with 2 little kids. I have a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old. So, and so lots is getting cut. And so I'd say that the grounding aspect, to refer to Christine's point, has to do with all the things that can get cut, realizing how much can get cut. And I've had to, all of a sudden, I've really had to put fast forward on figuring out how to implement the practices that I write about in my book in my own life. It was one thing to write them down aspirationally or as advice for people who might benefit from it, but it's entirely a different thing to have to open up the book and put those things into practice as ASAP right now. So I've been really grateful to have those words of wisdom that apparently I had one day a while ago.
It's the perils of being an author, is that you're going to be held accountable. I know. And I can only imagine homeschooling. I like teaching social science or history would have been quite an adventure. So I wanted to start with kind of a broad question for all of you. And all 3 of your books take stock of where young people are today. Teenagers heading into this world, the 21st century. And we know from a lot of, data that many of you cite, stress has risen pretty dramatically, not only for our general public, but in particular for young people. The kinds of stress that they face really are transforming and changing. I think, it's fair to say in some ways it's an age of anxiety. And so I just wanted to get your kind of first stop, like your impressions about where our young people are, where we are as families, as parents and teachers, and the like. Madeline, you write a lot about anxiety, and you write a lot about, in some sense, the fundamental word right now is uncertainty. And you couldn't have timed it better, because I think the COVID virus, there's not a single thing that we know in some sense at some level. Tell us what you learned both in thinking about this and then also in your clinical practice.
So I had no idea we were going to have a pandemic. And the book came out about 10 days before it was declared a pandemic. But it was clear that things were changing rapidly in the world, that jobs were going to be changing, that training was going to be changing, that education was going to be changing. And frankly, I was really interested. You're right. I've been doing this for 30 years. I was interested in the fact that in spite of how much is known through Christine's work, through Sarah's work, through my own work, through dozens of people, that rates of anxiety were escalating, that rates of suicide were escalating, that depression was kind of holding steady. But, for every completed suicide, there are 100 that aren't, or 50 to 100 that aren't. So I was curious about why it's been so hard to take what people know and lower the pressure. We know that the pressure on kids around grades, around college acceptances is just, and parents, by the way, Dacher, just for clarity, adults' rates of anxiety are up to the same extent that kids' rates of anxiety are up. So everybody is more anxious. And because we're anxious, I think we're treating our kids and protecting our kids from what we see as anxiety in all the wrong ways. So they're afraid to go on a sleepover. We tell them they don't have to, but we don't march for less pressure in the schools, which is something we should do. So are we anxious? Absolutely, yes. More so than we were when I wrote The Price of Privilege, which was not in the last century, it was in this century. Yes, and I wrote it then because 1 out of 4 kids were impaired. Now we have 1 out of 3 kids who are impaired, and we have a crisis. And so a lot of the kids who were kind of stable, not great, but stable, are having a very, very hard time now.
And I'm going to ask you all about the COVID-19 and how you think this will impact young people in the dimensions that you're interested in. Christine, you've, Raising Happiness, your first book, and then this most recent book, The New Adolescence, you keep returning to a central theme in the science of happiness, which is community and connection and social connectivity and interconnectedness. How do you take stock of where our kids are right now in terms of their relationships, their friendships? You tackle sexual relationships. What do you think our teens are up to, and where are they going in terms of community?
Well, we know that they're spending a lot of time on screens. I mean, even before they were all on lockdown at home, right? They're spending just a ton of time on screens, and that is affecting how they relate to one another. So screen time is, despite my kids' protests, it's a zero-sum game, right? Like the more time you spend on screens, the more time you're not spending doing things like that we used to do, old-fashioned things like working for pay out from not behind a computer. Like I worked in a fast food restaurant when I was a teenager, right? So, or, we think that they're spending so much more time on homework and extracurriculars. And in fact, they're not spending more time on those things. They're spending more time on social media. And we know that the more time they spend on their screens, the more time they actually spend alone, which has been such an interesting finding, right? Like for me, this has been surprising to me, as starting where I did as a sociologist with my work in Raising Happiness was all about building community. And it just surprised me to sort of relook at the data with this generation and see, wow, this is the loneliest generation of kids we've ever seen. Like, of course they are depressed. Of course they're anxious. They're spending a lot more time alone. Half as many today spend time every day with some of their peers. This is before lockdown, of course, right? And those are just like they get together with their friends every day. Half as many do. And they're down on average an hour a day of just like hanging out with their friends in person. So, I mean, this is really interesting. And then we're not even getting into the fact that like their sexuality is now heavily influenced by their time spent online, both through porn and also through sexting and the dating apps and things like that. So this is like really a whole new world that is, of course, affecting their overall well-being and the way that they socialize, the way they create community, and what they perceive as connection, and also what those connections do for them from a nervous system standpoint, right? Like whether or not what they perceive as connections actually makes them happy or improves their well-being is an interesting thing.
Yeah, and we're going to dig deep into new social media. Madeline, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I did. Something that's really interesting to me along these lines, Christine, is for years, when I've met with an auditorium full of kids, I've asked them to rank order 3 issues of adolescence, and it's always been loneliness, identity, and friendship. And for 20 years ago, it was always identity, the defining issue of adolescence. It isn't anymore. And so for the last 5 years or so, without fail, that when I ask them to rank order, in wherever I am in the country, loneliness comes in first.
Yeah. No, it's an epidemic. I remember I was actually making almost a facetious rhetorical point with this question. And I asked my Berkeley class of 300, like, how many of you are in a long distance relationship and you've never seen your partner in the last 2 years? And like 60% raise their hands. I'm like, what kind of romance is where you don't see the person? It's strange, right? Well, added to this cocktail is what Sarah writes about in A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety. And, Madeline's talking about the enormous pressure our students feel, our young people feel. And I can only imagine as this pandemic unfolds and we lose 20% of our jobs and a lot of kinds of labor that young people move into, and then the pressures and the complexities of the new social media. And I want to kind of press you on that, Christine, and all of you, is our, and I think it's a new kind of anxiety, which is the anxiety about the environment. I think my generation worried a bit about acid rain, nuclear stuff, but this is really unprecedented. Here at Berkeley, in our College of Natural Resources, there's actually a clinical phenomenon of students who have environmental despair or apocalyptic environmental anxiety. What do you think about this, Sarah? How do you approach this?
It's no surprise to me. I've been leading environmental studies programs and teaching environmental studies for quite a few years now. And I noticed a change probably about 6 years ago, whereas before, it felt like students were just absorbing the content kind of like any degree that they would be taking. You're reading the material, thinking about it, and going on with their merry lives. It didn't seem like the content was asking them to fundamentally shift all of their assumptions and rethink what they think of as their futures. And about 6 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, things started to change. And all of a sudden, students' emotional despair, what Glenn Albrecht, the Australian philosopher, calls solastalgia, which I didn't have a word for at the time, of course. And then, of course, other terms like eco-grief. I started to figure out these names for it because I didn't have a background in psychology. I didn't have a background in affect theory or any of this stuff. And so when it started to intrude on my classroom, students' emotional engagement with this stuff, their despair, I realized I had to reckon with it. And that's the product of that is this book and a lot of changing in my approach to teaching and approach to young people. But it is so intense that it has changed so much in the classroom. And I think that one of the interesting things about it is that there's a positive here too. Before that, I think people could imagine being environmentalists or being environmentally conscientious without radical change. And I think that the grief and anxiety people are feeling is the feeling of having to change. And I think that's a good thing. And adaptation is a good thing. And the resilience that they're building in this pandemic, like fast forwarding through climate resilience right now, is probably a good thing. It's not going to be great for everybody, and it's going to be unevenly experienced across a lot of different demographic factors. but there is a potential here for something good to be happening for this generation. And overwhelmingly, this generation feels really strongly about climate change. And so the sort of unanimity about, a lot of people feeling this way, these are going to be our next generation of leaders. And I'm really optimistic about that.
Yeah, I hear you. It's interesting, and I wanted to get your reflections on COVID-19. I mean, it's such a dynamic time, and there are fascinating studies of, and this is largely in the studies of Twitter behavior and Instagram behavior and so forth, that after the onset of a trauma or a traumatic event like a terrorist attack or a big oil spill or a pandemic, it takes us like 3 to 4 weeks as a culture collectively. People are upset, confused, grieving. A lot of my students talk about grief because they lose parts of their education, uncertain. And then we start to land in a place, and that's about where we are right now, which is we're kind of landing on our feet. We have a rough sense of what this is and where it may go. And I'm really curious, just for you guys to reflect on what COVID-19 will be doing for young people through the lens with which you look at young people. Madeline, what do you think?
Oh, I agree with you that we're landing in a new spot, which is, I think we're done. Some of us are done with hoarding or terror or watching the news 24/7. All those kinds of behaviors are stopping to some degree. And I think for everybody, it's really a terrific opportunity to think about values. And, I feel like I'm going back to a very old-fashioned place, but that was in the book anyway, because we're going to depend on community. We're going to depend on a sense of agency, which is the opposite of mourning, right? In mourning, you don't have it, so you get over the mourning. And I think kids, by the way, it's not just that they miss their graduation, they miss their prom, they miss that night, they miss the job they thought they were going to have, they miss the city they planned, they have missed major milestones of adolescence and young adulthood. So I have a particular feeling, which is, look, this is awful, and I think there are things we can do to make it less awful for kids. But I also think there is the opportunity to to learn to sit in uncertainty, which is what is hard for every one of us. And in life in general, you learn that kind of discomfort in small increments, right? So you didn't get invited to the popular kids party, and then you didn't get the guy you wanted to go to the prom with. And, it's like increments. This is not incremental. This is all at once. And the last talk that I gave, I had asked the audience how many people had never had a broken heart. I had 600 people, and one person raised their hand. So one person out of 600 never had a broken heart. Well, how did you all survive that? You survived it exactly because you didn't get to go to the popular kids party or the sleepover or whatever. So I think that's the better way to build resilience, is incrementally. I think what we're asking kids to do is jump in feet first into learning to sit with uncertainty, into learning to be adaptable, into cultivating resilience that should have been done over a decade. It's being done in a short period of time. Do I think my kids are grown, so, and I have 3 millennial sons. They're working, they're trying to figure out with their wives how to manage it. I mean, their cohort, and we're so fortunate because we're not worrying about food on the table, and we're educated, and we're the luckiest people in the country right now. But it's a crash course in adaptability. Mm-hmm. And I've worked with young people my whole life. I, in general, think they're an adaptable group, especially the young people right now. And I think most of them will manage this crash course, and some won't. And kids who were vulnerable, just like adults who were vulnerable to start with, will be the ones to watch out for. And I do think we're going to have a mental health crisis when this is over, or not even when it's over. So I think we're having it right now.
Sarah, I know you, in your book, you really, it's almost as if you arrive at a very similar insight that Madeline was talking about, which is that I mean, the environmental news is really grim, in many ways, species loss, collapse, et cetera. And you really arrive at this point where you feel like part of how we move forward, especially young people with so much of their lives ahead of them, is to sit with uncertainty and to kind of make the most of it. Tell us about that.
Yeah, what Madeline was talking about really resonated with what I found with my students too, which is that they come in idealistic, they come in fairly, not entirely protected from trauma, but fairly protected from trauma, although I think as increasingly we have first generation students and a more diverse group of students coming into the CSU system, right. Educators are starting to figure out how to educate with trauma-informed practices or trauma-sensitive practices. And so I think one of the things that I find fascinating about environmental studies students or young people who are conscientious about the environmental issues is that they have been thinking about the uncertainty on the horizon for some time, and they have been worried about that for some time, and that's climate anxiety, right? And so in a funny way, what they called me to do 6 years ago or so when this started happening was to rethink the skills that they were going to need to deal with this uncertain future. And the skills that they were going to need to deal with it were not just technical skills to build stuff or innovate something or lead a political or legal situation to change policies around environmental issues. The skills that we're going to need were what Madeline calls deep adaptation skills. And that was a real awakening moment for me. And we've been thinking about that in the field now for quite some time. And I think the positive
what are
there.
Those? What are the deep adaptation skills? And
Sorry. Yes, thank you. Deep adaptation. So rather than thinking about sort of external to you kinds of skills, which is most of environmental sciences and studies teaches those kinds of skills. How do you fix these problems out there in the world? Looking inward and thinking about the interior skills that we're going to need to grapple with this stuff for the long term. And this is where I started to look really into thinking about how people have been looking at religion and spirituality and Buddhism and mindfulness as tools that people were going to need to stay engaged in this work for the long haul. And one of the aspects of that has been to kind of have a move against the kind of dominant American perspective that we're supposed to be happy, the science of happiness stuff that you are all experts on, right? And so you all know that happiness is a red herring, and that actually grief opens up all kinds of opportunities for all kinds of things, especially the interior work that people are going to need to do to engage in this stuff for the long term, because it is horrifying, and hope isn't going to keep us in it for the long time, right? The work that we're going to have to do to be able to cope with uncertainty and cope with that anxiety and be with it and be okay with it is there. And so I think I've been really encouraged by the fact that my students are suffering in the exact ways that Madeline was talking about, really suffering. I'm not going to deny it, but they kind of knew this was coming, and they knew that this is what they've been planning for, and they make the connections. They know this is climate change. Coronavirus is climate change. This is one of the ways that climate change is going to be perceived or felt or manifested. And so this is fast forward for them, So.
Yeah. And it's interesting, that the science of happiness is informative because when we encounter suffering, it actually engages nurturant parts of the brain and the vagus nerve, and it's actually a very empowering pathway. So it's good to kind of broaden our thinking about the nature of suffering today. Christine, you've thought a lot in your scholarship and your writing about the networks of friendships that kids find themselves in and how important those are. And now they're sheltering at home with their mom and dad. Like, what could be worse?
Man.
And we probably all have personal stories for those of us who have kids at home. But what do I get a lot of calls studying touch. Like, people are like, oh my God, we'll never be able to touch a fellow human being again. I think that'll change. But what do you think will happen to young kids' friendships and adolescents dating, and as they're now spending 24 hours a day next to mom or dad?
Yeah, I have been asked this a lot from kids. I've been teaching high school classes, trying to help out with all the Zoom education. And the kids themselves are asking me, what is going to become of us in this whole thing? Because the social distancing, of course, goes against their every developmental instinct. I mean, it goes against our instincts as humans, maybe, just as clannish mammals, right? But for teenagers, of course, they're much more attuned to their peer group. And feeling separated from them is devastating to them in a way that is sometimes hard for us to even imagine. So I've been spending a lot of time explaining to them about grief, right? Like, I think one of the silver linings here in this is that the kids have the opportunity to actually name what they're going through as grief. And I'm actually talking about grief with a lowercase g, right? Some teenagers, of course, are grieving actual death of family members because of this. That's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking more about what Madeline was talking about, and also what Sarah have been talking about, that like it's really helpful for these kids to understand that the physical presence of their friends is a major loss for them. And so they might be experiencing the 5 stages of grief, right? And to like in our household, it's hilarious because I'll say, oh, well, that's denial when they talk about how it's not a risk anymore. Or when they start negotiating to see their friends, I'm like, oh, I see that you're entering the bargaining stage again. Right? Like we talk about, like, and just helping them name their sadness, we've kind of come around to this idea that acceptance is the 5th stage of grief, and that it actually has some benefits over resistance to something like this. So it can be a really meaningful thing for them to learn about and to really experience that discomfort. And at the same time, something that's kind of interesting, I didn't know this before this crisis, but David Kessler, who worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross on the stages of grief, he's added a 6th stage, which is meaning. And I think that that's the most important one for teenagers today, right now, to sort of, arrive at a connection to something larger than themselves, right? They can't have the connection that they really want, which is the physical connection to their friends, right? But they can connect into a larger sense of community and meaning. And so this is something that, I'm asking kids all the time and advising parents to, like, you can't force them to get to acceptance or to meaning, but you can ask them, what do you really care about in this situation, right? What does all of this mean to you? How do you want to use your skills and talents to improve this situation? What are you really feeling? The question that I come back to almost every day at dinner time. I mean, it is shocking how often I use this. At some point, I'm sure my kids will like put it on a t-shirt for me. But we talk about the fact that their grandchildren are going to ask them about this experience. And so the question is, what do you want to remember? What do you want in particular to remember about your role? Do you want to remember that you got stuck in the bargaining stage? Like all you did was hound me to see your friend? And of course there's more to it. And adolescents in general, once you sort of help them gain a little bit of perspective, they can connect right into that environmental piece in a way that is much easier than for other generations, I think.
Christine, can I ask Christine a question?
Sure.
Or say something? I completely agree with what you said, but I think in some ways that starts with parents having given some thought to that themselves. So there is a narrative that will come out of this for every family. And it may be different for different family members, but I think it's hard to tell your child, go find some meaning when you're in your room with your 5th glass or your 5th margarita and, not functioning well. So I think parents really are modeling for their kids how you deal with a crisis. And what's interesting to me is nobody knows. So even you get a panel of experts, right? We're a panel of experts. And people keep calling with, Dr. Levine, what are the best practices? And I always say, listen to that second word, practices. There is no practice for this. We've never had to do this before. So we're all kind of flying a little bit by the seat of our pants. I mean, we have a lot of knowledge, but not in this situation. And I love the idea of talking to kids about what their narrative is going to be. But I think we need to have one too. And that can be a group discussion, that can be an individual discussion.
Can I jump in about something there too? I think one of the things about climate anxiety that can be applied to the coronavirus anxiety problems with young people in particular is what I've sort of come to the conclusion myself, and I'm sure you would all agree, that the most important thing that young people can do to feel like they can engage in the hugeness of the problem that feels so much bigger than them, right? That there's a sort of like a vertigo feeling of powerlessness that comes with young people, that it fuels that anxiety that you've all been writing about and talking about. So therefore, I think that the really most important things that young people can feel is that they can actually do something in the face of the problem. And that the knowledge that they might have about the immediate anxiety and sort of trauma that we're all going through, the ability to just know that that's what's happening, and that it will end and there'll be something after that. Just the ability to see it and have that one level of move of distance, of recognition of what those feelings are, that skill is that's a good practice. I mean, you were saying, Madeline, that we don't have practices for us, but well, we sort of do. We have the tool of mindfulness, of allowing ourselves to kind of move back into the prefrontal cortex to get our thinking mind to help us, counter the amygdala anxiety, real panic, of which I have felt a lot of myself. I'm sure you all have too. And also to always be thinking about, what do I have control over today? What's right in front of me today? What can I control today? I have some agency today. And those things are things that I have realized over time as a teacher with climate anxiety. And I'm now thinking, well, I need to just think about how to plug all those exact same things into what's happening today, and I have to do them to myself. And so I'm trying to model that for my kids too. But we spend every single day writing a list of all the things we're going to look forward to that day, for example. And that's just one of those kinds of reverse gratitude practices, right? Like you start the day thinking, when those things happen, like lunch, when lunch happens, I'm going to be so into it because in the morning I was looking forward to it. It's so much more than the mundane lunch that you'd have on a regular day when the crisis is not happening, right? So these kinds of things where we feel we have agency over the day and that we can find pleasure and beauty and simplicity in those things as much as possible. It's super hard to sort of replace the acute anxiety. Those practices we do know, and they're applicable in this crisis for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's part of what families have been trying to rediscover is to rebuild a structure that has those practices and those rituals in it, and with some false starts and some occasional surprises. So I wanted to drill down into some specifics before we turn the corner and think about like your roadmap for our youth today. Putting aside COVID-19, but and really sort of think more specifically about some of the things that you guys really grapple with, and they're really timeless questions that I bet you get questions all the time from parents and kids. I know when I speak to parenting audiences, I do. And I want to start with you, Christine, which is the new social media, Instagram and Facebook, if kids are on it, not that much. And then all the ways in which they are on screens. And it's a complicated empirical literature. It's and in fact, I would say, taking a look at it, we know some things, but there's a lot that is still mysterious. There's just a study out from the UK, 10, 12,000 students, no relationship to anxiety or well-being in terms of just general screen use. But how do you make sense of this complicated literature and start to think concretely about what our youth are doing and what they're missing out on?
Yeah, I think that it is incredibly complicated. And one of the things that I do is I go back and I look at all of these studies, and even that one from the UK, I think a lot of these studies, they get misreported on in the media. And so I do think that there are certain things that are kind of commonsensical that we know and that we can trust, right? We know that there is an advantage to face-to-face communication, and that the development of in-person social skills are important too. We also know that these new technologies can be really important tools and can also facilitate connection and communication. They're not all bad. And I think that it's important to see that often there's a dosage effect, right? That these new technologies are really good to a certain level and a certain amount of time. And I think that varies quite a lot depending on how sensitive the kid is and the gender of the kid and the kid's peer group and all those kinds of things. And then, a lot of times it'll turn the corner, right? Certain of my own children, one of them is so sensitive that she cannot be on Instagram at all because it's just the social comparison for her. She just can't, even with her great self-awareness of how it makes her feel, she can't sort of enter into Instagram and the sort of all the whole liking thing, right? Like she just gets obsessed. And so that's the kind of thing that I think is really interesting because she's really learned how to have agency, right, over the social media. She does use Snapchat. She does use TikTok, right? And one of the most fun things about this for me as a parent has been after dinner, the kids come to me. I don't have TikTok, but they've curated their TikTok accounts where they've saved the videos that they think will make me laugh the hardest, right? And it's almost like a game, who has the one that made her fall off her chair laughing, right? So this is a clear example of how these things can be incredibly positive. I mean, these kids are so creative and hilarious. It's like a new form of comedy, right? I think that one of the kids to me just sent a meme which said, it was an essay prompt in 50 years from now for some class, discuss the use of memes for coping with COVID-19. Right? These things can enter into actually a really healthy social environment as well. And so I think the trick right now and always is to model the behavior that we, healthy screen usage ourselves, to carve out, now while we've got our kids home especially, right, carve out times and places that are still screen free, right? The dining room, the kitchen, the bathroom, these are all excellent places to just be alone with your thoughts. It's hard to enforce some of them, but in theory as a family, we can go back to some having times and spaces that are a little bit more old-fashioned and allow for some uninterrupted face-to-face interaction. And then we can ask our kids, how do they feel about that, right? Does it make them anxious, right? It comes out, does it make them feel, how are they coping with the boredom of eating breakfast without social media,
Yeah. There's so much wisdom there because we know kids, adults, half of our temperament is genetically shaped, and we just have these massive differences. Some kids are sensitive, some love as much social attention and contact as possible. And really what that tells us with respect to social media is get your kids to trust their gut about it, right? That if it's making them agitated to be on Instagram, that says something, right? And to find agency in that. I'm curious, Madeline and Sarah, you guys are working in clinical settings and thinking about orienting the youth toward the environment. Are there more specific lessons about finding agency with the new social media in the realms that you guys work in? Madeline?
Finding agency. I have very mixed feelings about social media because I've been around since it started and before there was any social media. My concern about social media is sort of narrow, and it really has to do with what it squeezes out much more than what it contributes. So clinically, I have kids who spend a lot of time on social media. They're popular, their grades are good, they're good in the family. They are meeting all their developmental milestones well. I don't care really what they're doing with social media because they're on track And then I have other kids who spend all their time on social media because they don't have the skills that they need to live a life. And, you know, we were talking about a little bit about what's protective. I mean, things like self-regulation is, how do you become resilient in life? You can modulate your feelings, you know how to talk to other people, you have a sense of agency and control. I mean, those things need to be developed. If they're developing, and I think it's an hour too much of social media, I leave it. And another kid who might be spending time, I have 3 sons. My middle kid is very creative. He's in New York. He's directing. He did wonderful things on social media, creative things on social media. It was a great use of collaborative time. So I think the research is unclear to some degree at this point. I think there were, you know, Jean Twang's research came out and it's like, boom, you know, we all got messed up when we started watching a lot. And I don't think it's that simple. And like Christine said, every kid is different. So you know, we all want sort of one rule in the household. And I can remember with my boys, it was sort of like, he doesn't have to do that. Well, he's not you. And there really need to be general rules. And then I think you need some different rules for kids. But I'm not opposed to social media in a blanket way. I don't think anybody's opposed to it in a blanket way, because it's like Christine says, it has advantages and disadvantages. You want to know what it's pushing out. And clinically, what I see it pushing out is the girls who walk into my office sobbing and they hold their phone out and they show me their phone, and, you know, they're 14 and their boyfriend just broke up with them on phone. And the message is anywhere from just callous to treacherous. And they have no way of responding, and the boy didn't see anything. Those are the places where social media is damaging in terms of socio-emotional learning, which I think is fundamental to adaptability.
Sarah, how about yourself? What are you seeing in the environmental sphere? It seems like an opportunity in some ways, right? To disseminate information and public consciousness.
Yeah. So I make an argument in my policies in the beginning of the class that if students at the college level want to really do this sort of environmental work that they claim they want to do, I make an argument that the spending all the time on their phones and their computers while in the classroom setting or while they're trying to focus on something else actually is an unenvironmental thing to do. And so I try to walk them through that argument and see if I can get more buy-in and them to agree to not doing it, so that they don't feel, I mean, I'm fortunate to work with college kids, so I don't have to have rules without explanations. I try to make arguments and hope that they choose to go down this path with me. So that's one thing that I try to use it as an opportunity to think about the relationship between our desire to use the social media as a distraction from being present in our boring moments and our having to face our ugly selves and our ugly world. There's a great cartoon that I put in the book that has a father at the beach with his little kid, and then he asks the little kid what the little kid is hearing inside of the shell, right? The shell at the beach. And the kid starts saying, I'm hearing all the sea level rise and climate refugees and boats drowning and the whales dying and all these awful things happening. Can you please give me my iPad back? And so there's this idea that, that what I like about that cartoon is not that it's a criticism of young people. I don't agree with it, but that there's a reason why we would seek out those distractions, and learning how to not feel the need to avoid those distractions, that what Buddhists call the aversion thing, grasping an aversion. The desire to avoid those kinds of things is where we have an opportunity to investigate and to think about how that's shaping our environmental values. And so that's one thing I think about. On a different note, this is less about social media than about media in general. One of the chapters in my book is about how it is that narratives shape our grief about or anxiety about the climate and other problems in the world. And if we agree that if we can start to have tools around media analysis and media consumption, we'd feel a lot better about the problem, not because there aren't the problems, but because we start to realize that media exploits and uses against our agency. It uses negative frames around climate change and all kinds of things. And that's just because that's what that's what feeds media, right? Media gets money and advertisers when it is negative about stuff and when it has, really shocking, spectacular stuff going on. And so I try to teach young people about the ways that media exploits our attention, exploits our amygdalas, and why it is that we can actually have some control over that. We don't have to participate in that. And that's super helpful, especially when they realize that also they have an instinctual reptilian brain desire to seek out negative stuff, because we have this residual, survival instinct that if we pay attention to the negative stuff, we might stay alive better. And so combined, that's a really nasty, toxic, compelling reason for us to be spending a lot of time in bad news. And that's not just social media, that's media in general. And I think these kinds of tools around media analysis have very powerful existential, emotional effects on anxiety.
Yeah. So I want to turn to, and I bet our listeners are really wondering, like, man, this is a tough portrayal. And for those of you who work with young people, like all of us do, and have, some of us young adults, it does feel complicated what they're facing in terms of, what you've written about, Madeline, which is the enormous pressure in schools, the environmental eco-grief that students are feeling, the kind of disconnect socially that Christine has written about. And I want to kind of turn the corner and think about if this is an opportunity in this moment to shift our values, shift some of the habits that we've fallen into, shift what we put into our minds. What you guys really see as like key principles for 16-year-old or a 20-year-old to be really hanging on to right now, kind of, and where your thinking came from. Madeline, it seems like a lot of what you write about is about handling uncertainty. So what do you think are some of the kind of key principles for resilience you're hoping to see?
I'll say that in a minute. I'll tell you that in a minute. But what I want to talk about just for a second is that one of the reasons that we are still making bad decisions, I think, is that what I learned from writing that book, we've all written books, so you got to be really learning something new to stay married to a book for 3 years, is that when in times of uncertainty, people make a particular kind of bad decision. And that particular kind of bad decision is they tend to look backwards as opposed to forward. So, for example, at Challenge Success right now, my project at Stanford, the first couple of weeks, everybody was just nervous. What do I do? How do I talk to my kid? What's best practices? Now we're right back to, how's my kid going to get into Harvard? And it's like, really? How's your kid going to get into, why is that what you're thinking about? And it's, well, I went to Harvard or Brown or whatever, and I'm successful, so my kid will be. And the issue when you're looking at something new and different and uncertain is you have to be open to different kinds of solutions. Maybe Brown will be the best place to have been educated in 15 years, Christine, when your kids grow up, and maybe it won't be. But I think we need to understand that there is a certain kind of backward-looking decision we tend to make in uncertainty exactly when we need to look forward. And I said I'd answer your question, and I just forgot it. Tell me again.
Well, I think you guys all grapple with, and one of the really empowering parts of reading your books is, I think a lot of people feel this sense of anxiety and fixed mindset, and perfectionism in our young people, and then the clinical issues that can surround those tendencies. And so, where should we put where should kids really start? What kind of skills should they be developing coming out of this sort of particular analysis that you offer?
So I think the skill set is fairly clear, actually. I think I've worked with adolescents my whole life. Every time a kid is in trouble, or almost every time, it's a failure of self-regulation. And I'll check that out with Christine in a minute. But it's the kid who drives drunk or puts somebody in the car or shoplifts. They're all failures in self-regulation. And part of that is because, for reasons that are not entirely clear, parents have chosen to protect their kids from consequences. Right? I'm so anxious, right? If I'm so anxious, I can't tolerate another dose of anxiety in my child, right? Because I'm filled up with my own anxiety. So if my kid is going to be anxious about the dog or the sleepover or the party, I'm gonna make that easy. Like the woman in my book, her kid's not invited to the popular girls' sleepover, so they make a bigger sleepover to steal those kids from the other girls' parties, right? This is terrible. You know, the mom thinks she's lessening her kid's anxiety. She is robbing her of the opportunity to prepare for tolerating unhappiness. I mean, that's life, is that you will be disappointed, you will have to sit with uncertainty. And I think that kids are so pressured in one arena, which is academics, and nobody really knows. I mean, I spent 3 years talking to the heads of major corporations and the Army and the Navy, and it's like that old skill set, maybe. My husband's cousin is the head of neuroimaging at NIDA, the division of NIMH. And I always call him when I write a book because he knows much more than I do. And I said, is there any change in the scientists that you're hiring now from 15 years ago when I wrote Price of Privilege? And he said, absolutely. What is it? He said, content has gone to the bottom of the list. Now, he doesn't mean that content doesn't matter. He means that there's a whole bunch of other things that matter. Can you collaborate with people? Can you iterate and reiterate without losing your enthusiasm? Just a lot of things that are different. So I think self-regulation, I think socio-emotional skills are critically important. I think perseverance is critically important. And I think a sense of meaning. And there's more, but if I I'm out, that would be them.
And we'll get to sense of meaning. That's going to be my last question for you guys, and I love your particular takes on it. Sarah, I want to ask you. You know, it's interesting. Just you've already given hints of this, sort of almost like a Buddhist approach to environmental calamity or emergency or whatever you would call it, and you write about kind of this new orientation to this tough environmental situation that young people face, the glut of information. It's hard to find good news, although there's good environmental news during COVID-19, a lot of it. But tell us about that. Like, what do you have people really looking into some of the hardest facts and findings?
Well, I was gonna, I may circle back to Buddhism, but I wanted to really answer this question about what's the skills that young people are going to need in this moment. And I think that the skills are going to be existential, and they can come from Buddhism and they can come from whatever, but that for me, Buddhist insights have been the most helpful for my existential capacity. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm drawn to writing about them in the book. But I think one of the interesting, wonderful things that's going to be criticized or shaping our young people differently in the next generation because of COVID is a really strong sense of our interdependence with the environment and our interdependence with each other. Ironically, in the middle of social distancing, precisely for the reasons that Christine was talking about, we are way more aware of our need for each other and our need for community and our need for relationships. And I think one of the things that I write a lot about in the book that I had to come to, because I was brought up on the kind of American myth of the individual and this kind of sense of you go away from your family and you go off to college and you never look back, and you know, this kind of always rewriting yourself. That's not, turns out that in my research that's not actually a good ingredient for empowerment, agency, coping with grief, the ability to come back after a crisis. It turns out that community resilience and trust and social relationships is the number one predictor in how a community is going to return after a crisis. And so you see this absolutely happening everywhere. Mutual aid programs, just transition networks. I mean, the amount of evidence for this already been put into place before COVID happened is overwhelming. And if you were paying attention to it, you would have been breathing a different oxygen than despair. You'd be breathing this oxygen of connection and interconnection. And I think that there's going to be a really great, wonderful shift and a new set of skills coming out of the next generation of prioritizing that over individualist pursuits. And that just leaves us all feeling powerless because we're always feeling like the work is never done. We individually can't do anything in the face of the problem. And so the critique of the individual and the critique of powerlessness that comes with that, I think is going to be really a great skill for the next generation. And that can come from recognizing the Four Noble Truths and learning about suffering, but it can come from all kinds of places. So.
Yeah, it's so interesting that in the science of happiness, there's this idea of homo economicus, that we're separate, we're individual, we're greedy, we're competitive, and those are really being called into question right now.
Yes.
And I hope that you're right, that our young people have a sense of that. Christine, what do you in some sense, our young people today face inordinately complex social worlds. You've got the digital world, the virtual reality world that's on the horizon, the real world, a complicated economic world that they're heading into right now. What do you really feel are some of the key principles you hope young people adopt?
I kind of want to speak to what parents and what the adults can do for the young people, since that's mostly who's watching this. How do we adapt? How do we adapt to this global pandemic, but then afterwards? And that even before this, what we're looking at is this incredibly accelerated rate of change. That's the context in which these kids are growing up, and really lagging adaptations. And so I think as parents, of course, we need to adapt our parenting, sometimes quite dramatically, so that these kids can thrive. But I think the best way for us to start is by adapting ourselves, right? Like taking care of our own anxiety, taking care of our own stress, because that is really the way that we will bring our most skillful parenting or our most skillful adaptations. The kids definitely learn from us a lot of their coping skills. Even once they're teenagers, they're still watching, especially when they're living with us 24/7. So I think starting with ourselves is and basic self-care and basic stress management is really important. I do think that there's an incredible paradox here with that. I always say, start with yourself. And people say, well, isn't that selfish? No, actually, the paradox is that if what you want is to really improve your own well-being, then probably the most effective thing that you can do is look to support others. And I don't mean look to micromanage your children. I'm not really, I'm talking about people outside of your own identity, and probably outside of your family as well, certainly outside of your immediate family. So this is where we get into the meaning piece of things again. I think that meaning really comes from the light that we find in dark times. And so there's a real opportunity here for all of us to provide tangible or practical or emotional support to the world that is suffering. That I think that that's the best next step forward for our happiness and our well-being.
Yeah, nice. So I want to end our wonderful conversation with a question that almost every young person asks me, of the thousands of young people that I interact with in different ways. And you guys have been referring to it throughout our conversation, which is meaning, purpose. Sarah, you really think about it in terms of calling, that young people in this anxious time, facing the kinds of things we've been talking about here, what they really should be doing is just thinking hard about, or feeling hard about, calling. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, as a college professor, I've seen so many students come in and their main concern is understandably always, can I get a job with that? What will this major let me get a job in? It's the question of their parents during, prospective student days and orientation. And I get it all the time. And I think it's, I have to humor the question and I have to answer the question, but it has caused me to have a real sense of pause about what it is that these young people think that they're going to be doing with their lives. And I think Madeline referred to it a little bit earlier when she sort of said content is no longer as valuable. In a similar way, the content of a degree and what sort of job title it's going to give someone, or a career title it's going to give someone, is really a side point. If young people spend a lot of their time trying to pursue those kinds of instrumentalist orientation to their jobs, they will they really will miss all these opportunities to turn jobs into the things that they love and that resource them for the long term. And so I think that we really need to think about it quite differently with dealing with young kids. But the jobs that are possibly out there for the passions that they have and for the callings that they have will come. It would be the worst tragedy for everyone to waste their time and waste their lives pursuing things that they felt that they should be doing, or that's going to get them the best job. And unfortunately, that's not young people's fault. That's our situation with student debt. That's the corporatization of higher education and what's happened in a larger economic situation, which is really regrettable, and it's only getting, unfortunately, much worse under COVID right now. But if we can push back a little bit on that and spend some time assuring them, yes, they'll get a job, and here are some skills you'll need to get that job, but let's do all of that inner exploration work to figure out what it is that you value and how you can make a vocation out of what you value. That's one of the beautiful things I love about this country, actually, is that people can do that from absolutely all positions if they spend that inner work figuring that out. And the earlier we do it, the more time we spend doing that, the faster we'll get to that vocation and not waste a lot of time running around chasing our tails. So,
what's a specific way in which you get? I mean, it's an abstract concept. I value justice, or reducing suffering, or aesthetic beauty, whatever the case may be. How do you bring that into your conversation with young people?
Yeah, so there are, for example, students who want to do environmental studies often think that they have to look up jobs with the word environment in the title. And it turns out that if they do that personal investigation, they realize that they really are passionate about art, and that you can do environmental work doing art stuff in lots of different places that have never had the word sustainability or environment or anything in it. And I think that kind of open-mindedness about how a vocation can evolve into something that looks nothing like the degree title that you got is really important to free up people to have that kind of imagination. And so just to, in sum, answer your question, the thing, let's say I care about social justice. Let's take that example you gave. I care a lot about social justice and the connections with the environment. That kind of vocation can happen in so many different arenas and sectors and jobs and careers. So how do people narrow that down? Well, then they have to think about things like what their priorities are. Do they want to have family? Do they want to, how do they feel about time? How do they feel about freedom? All of these things that career counselors are really well equipped to help students do. And they're always structuralized in higher education. The question is how to take advantage of them, because they help students figure out those kinds of things too.
Nice. Madeline, I wanted to get your final thoughts on what I found to be a revelation in your book. And you talk about these two different kinds of paths in life. And, there's a linear path where it's like you go after one thing for 45 years. And then there's a squiggly, what you call a squiggly path, a meandering path where we move in different directions and meander, and sometimes perhaps aimlessly so. I try to convey to my students, take that, make sure you meander and make sure you get ready for course shifts and directions. Tell us about that. Like, how do you give people that wisdom?
So the reality is almost everybody that I know has been on a squiggly path. And I think it's in the book where I ask every audience that I speak with now, and it's always 0 to 10% took a straight path. There's always somebody who knew they wanted to be the botanist from the time they were born and they became a botanist, but most people don't. And I'd even challenge the word of meaningless meandering. It's like there is a meaning to what you can't do well or what you don't do. I was a teacher. I was a terrible teacher, but I liked talking to the kids. So was that a failure or meaningless? Not really, because it told me what I was good at and what I wasn't so good at. I was thinking about so anyway, let me finish squiggly path. That's how most people become successful. Every person that I spoke to who was the head of something or another had tried other things. It was really almost impossible to find somebody who had taken that straight path. And they all said, just do something you love. Just do something you love. Now, how hard is that to do when everything around you is pressuring you to go, that direction. Your parents, the school, the media, the culture, everything is saying, go to finance because that's where you're going to make money. And it's like at the Ivy Leagues at one point, 65% of kids were finance majors. It can't be that 65% of kids all of a sudden decided that money was the most interesting thing in the world. So I think you need a big space for kids with lots of opportunities and lots of options. You need to listen to them. It's an inviting question. What interests you? Why? What about that? Tell me about it. I'm practicing for 35 years. No kid has ever said, my parents listen too much. They just don't. They say my parents talk too much, but they don't. I think we need to listen to kids and ask the kinds of questions that expand their thinking about what they can do in life rather than constrict them.
Nice. Christine, the last question is to you. So, you do a lot of work with parents and schools and teaching and writing about this. So what do you encourage going forward, into this really interesting 21st century? How should parents be orienting their kids or being part of that, coaching it, if you will?
Well, I think this pandemic is preparing us really well to prepare for, to value things that we previously took for granted, right? So it's, we're all talking about all these new ways of connecting through Zoom and all this kind of stuff. And frankly, these are not new ways of connecting for our kids. They've been using FaceTime and all the social media. They're really good at this. But what I think is new for them is how much they now value their face-to-face time. They used to get a lot of face-to-face time at school, right? And now I think they're going to really value that much more outside of school. And they have a whole new understanding of the isolation that comes from only having access through a screen. They did not believe us before, right? We adults who, talk about the olden days, I was always trying to explain what it was like when you just had to ride your bike to your friend's house in order to see them, and why it was completely and totally worth the effort of doing it, right? The effort of getting out of your pajamas, it was totally worth it. And so now I think that they will believe us, and that this is a silver lining.
Yeah. Well, Madeline Levine and Christine Carter and Sarah Ray, I feel wiser, and I feel like I've gained some insights, and I feel empowered and hopeful. And I wanted to thank you all for the books that you've written and for joining us on Unbound, Bay Area Book Festival's virtual conversation. It's been a real delight. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dacher.
Thank you.